11 people, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a washing machine that changed everything. That is where the story begins. Not on a stage in front of thousands of screaming fans. Not in a recording studio in Los Angeles surrounded by the greatest musicians of a generation. But in a tiny white bungalow on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, where the air always smelled of soul food and steel dust and the particular kind of hope that only grows in the middle of poverty. The house at 2300 Jackson Street was not supposed to produce a legend. It was supposed to produce workers. Gary, in the late 1950s, was a mill town. Its identity was built around the United States Steel Corporation, whose smokestacks dominated the skyline and whose shift whistles set the rhythm of daily life. Men went to the mill, women kept households together with whatever was left over, children grew up understanding early that life required work and that dreams were a luxury that the steel town did not reliably provide. Joseph Walter Jackson understood this completely. He had given up his own musical ambitions to support a growing family, trading the guitar for a crane operator's helmet and a spot on the mill floor. He worked double shifts when they were available. His hands grew rough. His back ached. He came home smelling of sweat and burning metal. But inside that modest house, surrounded by the noise of 10 children and a wife who held everything together with quiet determination and deep faith, something was alive that the mill could not suppress. Katherine Esther Jackson was the heartbeat of that household, a devoted Jehovah's Witness with a practical intelligence that stretched every dollar until it had given everything it had. She sewed the children's clothes on an old Singer machine whose needle clatter became one of the constant sounds of the house. She clipped coupons from newspapers and made journeys to the Salvation Army for bargains. She turned cheap cuts of meat into meals that fed 11 people and somehow managed to feel like abundance. When money got truly thin, Joseph would drive out to nearby farms and come back with vegetables that Katherine would preserve in glass jars, lining the shelves of the utility room like a small harvest stored against leaner times. That utility room, that is where the story inside the story begins. The old Maytag washing machine that sat in the utility room was not a quiet appliance. It rattled and shook and squeaked with a mechanical rhythm that filled the small space with something that was not quite music, but was not quite not music either. The rollers turned with a cath thump that varied in pitch as the load shifted, the agitator spinning with its own syncopated counterpoint. To most people, it was noise, background, the sound of household work being done. To a 3-year-old boy in a diaper with a baby bottle in his hand, it was the first orchestra he ever heard. Katherine would walk into the utility room on laundry days and find him there. Little Michael, 7th of 10 children, wide-eyed and completely absorbed, his small body moving with a precision and a responsiveness to the rhythm that made her stop every time. Not the uncoordinated bouncing of a toddler responding to sound. Something more intentional than that. Something that looked, even then, like understanding. His feet found the beat. His hips followed. His arms moved in a way that complemented rather than simply reacted. The bottle stayed in his mouth. The diaper stayed on. And he danced. Katherine would stand in the doorway and watch in silence. She had 9 other children. She knew what children in motion looked like, what their bodies did when music reached them. This was different. This was something she had no previous reference for. Years later, she would describe it with the careful wonder of someone who had spent decades trying to find adequate words for a thing that exceeded them. Most babies move without coordination, she would say. But Michael, even as a baby, when he danced, it was like he was an older person, like something was already formed inside him that just needed the world to make noise so it could respond. The Maytag became his first stage. Every time Katherine did laundry, she found him there. The household machine that existed purely for practical domestic purposes had become, for her youngest son, a source of something close to joy that was already inseparable from the act of moving his body in response to sound. Inside the house, the sounds of music had always been present. Joseph had never entirely abandoned his musical ambitions. He kept a guitar and sometimes played in local rhythm and blues bands on weekends. A detail that connected him to a world he had not quite been able to leave behind, even as the mill consumed most of his waking hours. The children grew up aware that music was not simply entertainment. It was a form of expression that carried weight, that had value, that meant something about who you were. The television that sat in the living room became a portal. The Jackson children watched it with the same hunger that children who have few other resources bring to the things that transport them. Ed Sullivan, American Bandstand, the particular electricity of seeing black performers command national audiences at a moment when the culture was only beginning to make space for that. Michael, barely old enough to be sitting upright in front of the screen, was transfixed by 3 figures whose influence would shape everything that came after. Jackie Wilson, James Brown, The Temptations. Jackie Wilson was elegance and fire together. He moved with a grace that made difficult things look effortless, a quality that would become central to Michael's own understanding of performance. James Brown was something else entirely, a force of nature whose relationship with rhythm was physical in a way that went beyond dancing into something that looked almost involuntary, like the music was moving through his body rather than being performed by it. The Temptations provided a different education, the architecture of group harmony, the discipline of synchronized movement, the way 5 voices could become a single instrument. Michael did not watch these performers the way other children watch television. He studied them. He broke down their movements the way a scholar breaks down a text, looking for the principles behind the surface, the logic beneath the spontaneity. And then he tested what he had learned. The older Jackson boys had begun rehearsing. Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and Marlon had started working on their harmonies and choreography with serious intent, understanding that their musical gifts might represent the ticket out of Gary that their father had spoken of in those quiet moments of determination around the dinner table. They worked in the living room after the furniture was pushed aside, playing records and trying to mirror what they heard and saw. They struggled. Harmonies that seemed simple on a recording revealed hidden complexity when 4 voices attempted them without professional guidance. Choreography that looked natural on a stage looked awkward and mechanical when you were figuring it out by yourself on a worn floor in Indiana. And then the youngest of them would step forward. Michael, years younger than his brothers and barely tall enough to be visible in the group, would watch them work and then simply show them what to do. He would step into the space they were occupying and demonstrate the move they were struggling with, execute it with a completeness and a confidence that left his older brothers temporarily speechless. He was not imitating what he had seen on television in any simple sense. He was translating it, adapting it, improving it. He had an instinctive understanding of what a movement needed to communicate, what it needed to feel like, how the body had to be organized in order to produce the effect that the music was asking for. He became the choreographer of a group in which he was the youngest member. This is not a detail that can be adequately explained through the ordinary vocabulary of childhood development. Something was operating in that small body that had arrived there without instruction. The percussion came naturally, too. He taught himself to play the bongos and conga drums, sitting on the floor of the house with the drums between his legs and working out rhythms that complemented what his brothers were singing. No teacher had shown him how to find the beat or how to vary it in ways that added texture rather than distraction. He found it himself, the way certain people find things that seem to have been waiting for them. Katherine had a habit of watching her children from doorways. She would be in the kitchen or the hallway, and she would hear something that made her stop and look. One evening, the older boys were working on a Temptation song that had a high harmony line that none of them could quite reach. They kept attempting it and missing it, the note sliding away from them, the attempt close enough to hear the intention, but not close enough to be the thing itself. The frustration in the room was building. The record played again. They tried again. They came close and missed again. And then a voice cut through. Small, but absolutely certain. Hitting the note not as an approximation, but as a fact. Katherine dropped the plate she was holding. She did not register the sound of it shattering on the kitchen floor. She stood in the doorway with her hands still wet, completely still, looking at her youngest son standing in the middle of the living room, singing the note that his older brothers had spent the evening trying to find, and dancing at the same time, his feet making shapes on the floor that no one had taught him. The older boys stopped. They looked at him. The room held something that was bigger than any of them knew what to do with. Katherine would describe that evening for the rest of her life. Not because she needed the story to prove something she already knew, but because the moment had a quality that defied erosion. It stayed complete. It stayed specific. The shattering plate, the wet hands, the voice, the feet. The way everyone in that room understood simultaneously that something had shifted and that nothing would be quite the same again. What followed was not overnight fame. It was work of the kind that only becomes visible in retrospect, when the destination is known and the journey can be mapped backward from it. The Jackson brothers entered every talent competition that Gary offered. School auditoriums, church events, local stages where the audiences were neighbors and community members who had watched these boys grow up and were now seeing them become something different from what they had expected. They won, consistently and often dramatically. The talent show at Theodore Roosevelt High School in 1966 became one of those defining early moments. The auditorium filled with high school students who arrived expecting to see children perform and instead witnessed something that confused their expectations about what a child could be. Michael, barely tall enough to reach the microphone, delivered a performance that the older audience members present compared afterward to watching a professional. The Jackson.5 took first place against competitors who were years older and had been performing far longer. The victories accumulated. Chicago came next, and with it the Regal Theater on the South Side, a venue with genuine history where the smell of old velvet and decades of performances hung in the air. Bobby Taylor was in the audience one night when the Jackson.5 performed. Taylor was a musician with connections, someone who understood the difference between talented and exceptional, and who recognized immediately that what he was watching on that stage was the second thing. He approached Joseph Jackson afterward and said something that set in motion the events that would change all of their lives. These boys needed to be heard by Berry Gordy at Motown. Motown Records in the late 1960s was not simply a record label. It was the most important black-owned music business in American history, a company that had found a way to bring black artists to mainstream American and international audiences at a scale that had seemed impossible before Berry Gordy created it. The artists on its roster, Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, Diana Ross, and the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, were not simply successful musicians. They were cultural transformers, figures who were remaking what American popular music sounded like and who it could sound like. The path to Motown was not direct. It involved a detour that Katherine experienced from the kitchen of the Gary house as a period of bewildering silence. Joseph had talked about taking the boys to New York, along to an appearance on a nationally televised program that would have given them enormous exposure. Katherine waited by the telephone. Days passed. She made calls. She got no answers. Her worry grew into something close to fear, the particular fear of a mother who cannot locate her children and has no reliable information about where they are or what has happened to them. What was actually happening was that Bobby Taylor had convinced Joseph to redirect the trip entirely, taking the boys not to New York, but to Detroit, to the world where Motown lived. And on an evening in 1968, beside a swimming pool at a setting that contrasted in every way with the crowded two-bedroom house in Gary, the Jackson-5 performed for Berry Gordy himself. Smokey Robinson was there. Members of the Temptations were there. The people who had been Michael's television idols, the performers he had studied from the living room floor of the house on Jackson Street, watched a group of boys from Indiana, led by an 8-year-old who moved and sang like a distillation of everything they had built, perform for the man who ran the most important music company in the world. Berry Gordy signed them. When Katherine finally learned what had happened, when the truth of where her children had been and what they had done replaced the anxious uncertainty of those silent days, she experienced something that she would describe consistently across the years as one of the most significant moments of her life. Pure joy mixed with relief so complete it was almost physical. They had sent tapes to Motown before. This was different. This was real. The door that had seemed like it might always remain just slightly out of reach had opened. What no one in that Gary house could fully anticipate as they began to prepare for the change that was coming was the full weight of what success at that level would require and what it would eventually cost. The excitement was genuine and appropriate. A family that had known real scarcity was about to step into a world that bore no resemblance to the cramped rooms and shared beds and stretched budgets they had always known. But the story of Michael Jackson is not a story that permits easy celebration without complication. And the seeds of that complication were already present in the intensity that made him extraordinary. Even as a young child, the perfectionism that would define his work across his entire career was visible in ways that went beyond the usual seriousness of a talented child who wants to do well. If a move was not right, he practiced it until his body had absorbed it so completely that it could not be wrong. If a note was not landing where he heard it in his head, he sang it again and again until the gap between what he imagined and what he produced was no longer detectable. He did not accept approximations of what he was trying to do. He accepted only the thing itself. This drive was extraordinary. It was also exhausting in ways that were not always easy to see in a child, because children are supposed to have energy, supposed to want to practice, supposed to be enthusiastic. The particular quality of Michael's perfectionism was not the enthusiasm of a child enjoying something. It was the compulsion of someone for whom anything less than the fullest possible expression of what he was capable of felt like a kind of failure. This is not a comfortable thing to carry. It is also the thing from which the greatest art tends to emerge. The generosity that Katherine observed in him was real and consistent in ways that suggested it was not a learned behavior, but something that had arrived with him. The candy store he set up in the back room of the Gary house was an early expression of something that would define his public life decades later. A child who had very little but felt the impulse to share what little he had with neighborhood children who came to the window or slipped through the backyard. He sometimes charged a penny. He more often gave freely. The joy he experienced from the giving appeared to be its own reward in a way that Katherine watched with a kind of quiet amazement, because generosity at that age and in those circumstances was not something that could be taken for granted. That impulse would grow with him. As his wealth grew, his giving grew with it. Millions donated to charitable causes over the course of his career, hospital visits, orphanages, a children's charity that he founded, a song he poured himself into late in his life called What More Can I Give?, recorded with an all-star collection of artists, including Beyoncé, intended as an anthem of unity and charitable purpose that he never managed to release widely during his lifetime. Those close to him have said that if more time had been given to him, he would have made certain the world heard it. Katherine met Elvis Presley during the early years of the Jackson-5's fame at a show in Las Vegas where the contrast between the intimate Gary world she had come from and the spectacular artificiality of the casino showroom environment could hardly have been starker. She found him humble in a way that surprised her, a quality that she recognized because it was the quality she had tried to cultivate in her own children. Later, she would reflect that Michael, even in those earliest professional years, had a stage presence that unsettled even the most experienced performers around him. James Brown, a man who had built his entire identity on being the hardest act to follow in American music, reportedly declined to perform after the Jackson-5 at one occasion because the children had taken everything from the room and left nothing to follow. James Brown. The man Michael had studied from the living room floor in Gary, Indiana, the man whose relationship with rhythm had seemed almost supernatural on a television screen, did not want to go on after an 8-year-old boy and his brothers. Through everything that came after those years, through the extraordinary commercial success of the Thriller album, which became the best-selling album in recorded history and remains so, through the legal proceedings and the public controversies, and the complex private suffering that accompanied the public triumph, Katherine maintained a particular clarity about who her son had been and what had made him the thing he became. Michael died humble, even though he died rich. That sentence carries more weight than its simplicity suggests. It is not a statement about money, though the money was eventually real in ways that the Jackson Street house could not have imagined. It is a statement about character, about what survived the extraordinary pressure that fame at that level exerts on a person's sense of themselves. It is a statement about a boy who danced in a diaper to the rhythm of a broken washing machine, who gave away his candy to neighborhood children he barely knew, who stepped forward in his family's living room and showed his older brothers how a harmony was supposed to sound, who refused to accept anything less than the fullest expression of what he understood a performance to be. The house at 2300 Jackson Street still stands. It is smaller than the legend it contains. 2 bedrooms for 11 people, 1 bathroom, a utility room with a washing machine that rattled and squeaked its mechanical music to a toddler who heard something in that noise that would eventually be heard by billions of people across the world. What the house could not have known, what Katherine, standing in that doorway watching her youngest son, could not have known, was that the boy dancing in his diaper was not simply a talented child. He was something rarer, a convergence of genetic gifts and circumstances, and a particular quality of desire that only appears occasionally in the human story. And when it appears, it changes what people understand is possible. The washing machine stopped working years ago. The house eventually passed out of the family's hands. Gary, Indiana continued to be what it had always been, a working city trying to find its way through economic pressures that the departure of the steel industry made dramatically more difficult. But the house remains, and the story it contains remains. In the specific image of a child in a diaper with a bottle in his hand finding the beat in the noise of a household appliance remains as vivid and as strange and as true as it was when Katherine first saw it. From that rattling rhythm to the stages of the world, from a corner candy store to $1 million charitable donations, from directing his older brothers, footwork in a cramped Gary living room, to performing for 1 billion people watching a television, from the boy his mother called Mikey to the man the world would call the king of pop. The distance between those two things is almost impossible to measure, and yet they are the same person. And the line that connects them runs through a utility room in Indiana, where a washing machine played its imperfect music to the one person in the world who was listening to it in exactly the right way. Katherine Jackson knows this. She knows it the way mothers know the things about their children that no one else is positioned to see. She watched the beginning. She watched what the beginning became. And when she goes back to that small house and walks through rooms that used to hold 11 lives, she carries both versions of the story with her. The boy who danced to a broken washing machine, and the king he became.